So this is a lovely room that we get to be in for this last session. So thanks everybody for finding your way in here. So really fast, just to give you an overview of what we're going to do in this session, because there will be a number of people coming up. We have it broken into two parts. So the first is the patient organization role and perspective. I'm going to cover these first 2 points, and then David from CLL SA is going to give a case example of something that was worked on here in the UK and their success with that project. And then after that, we're going to get into how to include the true patient voice. And we're going to start with Zach. So he will be up here in a little bit covering the first part of this session, as well as a case study as well from Leukemia Care. And then we'll also have case studies from France and Canada about successful advocacy initiatives to give you a really good understanding of where people have done work and how well it has how effective it has been overall, which is good. So, if we're going to look at this, we've heard a lot of stuff at this session that we were just at about new drugs that are available and some of the struggles that some of the countries are facing, regardless of if they're high-income, low-income, middle-income countries. We know that these new therapies are expensive, right? And so in many cases, we're looking at is there a way that we as patient organizations can influence some of these decision-making? And there's lots of different definitions of access, but most people, when they hear access, they're thinking regulatory approval. But when we think about this from a patient perspective, what's really important to them is they get the best therapy choice for them, and it's available and administered. They experience real outcomes that are manageable and achievable regardless of where they live, right? So we want the best therapies for our patients. And I think that's really where we need to focus our thought process. It's not so much on a regulatory approval or what the regulators think. Let's always go back to what are we trying to do, and we're trying to get the best therapies for our patients. Okay, so if we're looking at the drug review process, drug review is just a systematic evaluation of a new therapy on and how it works in patients and what the effect is going to be for the healthcare system, right? So they look at clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, social and ethical impact, and really they're trying to inform healthcare policymakers about what is the total impact on society if we approve this medication. We know from what the clinical evidence shows often that it's going to have a benefit on patient health. So we will discuss that. There's often a concern, depending on where you live, for the monetary impact of adding a new therapy to any kind of formulary or drug basket, especially, like I said, many of the new things are expensive. But what's really important is they're trying to do a comparison to what's happening right now. And that's really where we can come in as patient advocates, is making sure when they're looking at that comparison between what this ideal or this new therapy is offering to our patient population, that we're making sure they fully understand what the patient experience is like right now. Because they're only going to look at efficacy of current medication. But we know a whole lot more is happening in that patient life than just whether or not they responded to a current therapy. And we just to take into consideration what we're facing when we're trying to do advocacy for new therapies. From a patient perspective right now, what's interesting are patients are definitely questioning more. We get a lot more feedback when, if you're talking to patients or if you're online with different patients on different forums and things, you hear lots of patients going, what is the best therapy for me? My doctor recommended this. Do you think that that's the right choice? And they're questioning amongst themselves. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily bringing all those questions back to their doctor, but they're definitely thinking about it. They're talking about it. They want to know if the choices that are being made are really the best. What you just heard in that session with some of our leading specialists, and by the way, those 3 doctors that presented earlier are all really keen patient advocate focused doctors. They're all highly supportive of what we do. So if you look at those docs, and all of them said, we think this is what we're going to do, but there are still lots of questions about how we organize these therapies and how we determine what's the best therapy for you or you or you. So if they're confused, our patients are definitely confused and have lots of questions. As well, there are lots of global conversations happening. The internet has made the world very small in lots of ways. And so patients are now very aware of new therapies that may be available in the United States, but not in Europe. Or they hear that a therapy was approved in Canada, yet denied in the UK. And that's creating a lot of discussion as well of patients going, why is that? Especially if each of these institutions that are approving medications are getting presented exactly the same clinical evidence. Why is something good enough for Canada, for example, but the information isn't good enough for the UK? We're okay with giving a less credible drug to Canadians? No, that's not really true. So why is it that people are looking at the information differently? From a health system perspective, they're definitely concerned with budget constraints. We all know that, we all recognize that. They have limited budgets. We understand, theoretically, why they're cautious with some of the new medications, right? So it makes sense that everybody only has so much money. So how do we bring our drug to the forefront or our patient needs to the forefront when there are so many other important issues that they're trying to deal with and they're facing, not only from us, but from many other organizations with different diseases. And we see those increasing costs of drugs are still going up and up and up. You know, a few years ago when we came out, when ibrutinib came out and we were looking at the price of ibrutinib per year, we're like, oh my goodness, nothing is ever going to be more expensive than that. And then welcome CAR-T, right? So we don't know what's coming next and what those costs are going to be like. So we know that there's going to be ongoing discussions about how we determine what is cost effective, right? When you're going into these discussions with your regulators. And we anticipate that we're going to see up. And then there's also a lot more therapy options. So you'll often see where there's information coming out from pharmaceutical companies that's based on phase 2 clinical trial data, rather than phase 3, which is more what used to happen in the past. There's lots of reasons for that, right? It gives therapy to a patient group that may not have had an option before, which is good. But it also, from a purely business perspective, it's good to have the first drug out in that class, right? Because as soon as other drugs come out that are more Me Too drugs that also serve the same patient population, it gets harder to get them approved, especially when they're expensive, and follow, those permanent therapies that you keep taking until you relapse or the drug doesn't work anymore. So it's just different things that we're trying to figure out, especially with these increasing number of therapy options for the same patient population. If it's all based on phase 2 trials and we can't show that this drug is better than the drug that you approved last month, that's also difficult to try and get across to a regulator that this should also be approved for our patient groups. The other thing that we're dealing with is all systems are not created equal. Some of us have very defined HTA processes within our countries, and we know exactly where we as patient groups can have a voice and where we're invited to participate. We may not always agree that it's enough or that we're invited in the right place, but we understand where we kind of fit, and there is a recognition that we should be included. In other places, that is just not happening. You're just not invited to the table. And really, decisions are being made without patients. And I know that patient groups are actively trying to figure out a way to engage in this. So really what we have to look at is different new ways of creating inroads into those areas. So where and how can we have a voice even if we're not invited to the table? And of course, regardless of where you are, and regardless of whether there's HTA, where patient groups have a voice or not, transparency is not happening. We don't understand every piece that's contributing to those decisions, right? They let us know so much, but they don't let us know the whole thing. And so this is just another area where work needs to be done, because it can help us then better support our patients if we can get some better information out. So what's really important here, whether you're invited to the table or not, our patients still deserve a place. And if nobody else can really do that except for us. So we have to figure out a way. And I want to show you a slide that may be a little depressing, but I'm going to do it anyways. So this is looking actually at decisions that were made. And this is a 2015 slide, and there may be a little shift here, but it's not going to be significant at this point. So it's just different groups. This is Australia, Scotland, England, and Canada. And they were comparing results that had a patient group submission and results that didn't have a patient group decision. And what you can see here is basically the approvals are exactly the same, right? So I know when you look at that, you're like, oh my gosh, that was so much work. And they look exactly the same. So is what we're doing really important? And that's why we're bringing in some case studies. Because what we have had recently, at least, we're seeing a lot of with these new therapies, where it's a second or third expensive therapy in some cases coming into our CLL patient population. We have been able to flip initial decisions because of advocacy work. And this is what we also have to think of, right? Like if you look at the different people that are often brought into the equation of an HTA decision or a drug approval decision, often our clinicians are invited to the table with a more active voice, right? The government, obviously, whoever's making the choices in your regulators for who's going to get funded have a voice. And economists definitely have a voice when they're deciding whether a drug is cost effective. And from what we saw before, even when patients are invited, we're not quite sure our voice is having an impact. But that doesn't mean that that's okay. So this is where we need to work to make sure that we can grow that patient voice into something real that is definitely influencing decisions. So this is what's really important that I have found in the work that I do. And that is that we are making sure that we have really good information and really understand well what is important to our patients, what has been problematic for them in their patient experience. And so when we're communicating, we know that we are really communicating with a solid global patient voice and not just your own experience or one person's experience, right? Do you really, really understand well how your patients feel, what happened when they took a certain pill, how the chemotherapy affected them? Do you understand all these pieces? And actually when Zach speaks, he's going to talk about gathering evidence and what that could look like. So I won't get into that too much, but it is really, really important that we're doing that. So review, right? So making sure you have good evidence, gather those extra pieces, and I'll talk about that in 1 second, and then you report back, making sure it's clear, concise, accurate, and balanced. So we know that we want a better drug for our patients. If we are finding out from our patients that the potential side effects of a new therapy are not something that they are willing to tolerate, even if it gives them some extra years of life, then we have to be willing to report that back. So you're going to report back what you hear. And we have had examples, I know when I was really actively working in Canada, which I did before I took on this role, we had cases where we went back to the regulators and said, you know what, we appreciate whatever decision it is you were going to make, but we tell you from a patient perspective, this drug is not an ideal choice. So if we get to choose, we would prefer other things be approved rather than this, okay? So don't think that everything that comes to market, you have to fight for. Some of the new stuff is not beneficial for your patient group in the same way as other things that may come to light. Okay. So where we can have impact, definitely we do not have any impact here. So if the regulators are questioning whether or not the clinical trial data is accurate and properly reflects an improved efficacy for patients, you usually cannot fix that. There was something wrong with the clinical trial design. That is not our problem. Okay, we cannot go back. What it does give us is a message to our pharma partners that you should include us in clinical design much earlier in the process so we could have fixed this for you up front. This often comes to play if there's a question about the comparator drug, for instance, and is it really accurate in that patient population, for instance. Or were the correct measurements used, toxicities, etc. We cannot control it by the time that it gets to us to help with a drug approval. We can have influence, obviously, on the patient experience, and we can have influence on the economic portion and explain why this drug may be worth it if you look and get them to not just look at that monetary amount, but look at how much that improves the patient life. I want to talk about this really fast, right? Is the clinical evidence. You have to do your homework. If you are going to go out there and fight for a drug, you better understand what the clinical trial is saying. And I know not everybody has that literacy to read clinical trials and really understand, but reach out, find out from people that do have that capacity. Brian's good. We're happy to help. I have a different kind of staff working at Lymphoma Coalition, for instance. We're happy to, including a doctor, we're happy to provide feedback if you want to understand. What we do when we go in is we will go into a clinical trial and we'll mark it all up where we'll go, oh, that was weak, this is good, and kind of highlight that when we're working through to make sure if arguments come up, we'll have an answer for them. But these are things you can definitely look at basically when you're looking at a clinical trial, right? Does it address symptoms or issues that your patient population have told you are a priority? Do the clinical benefits mean what do the benefits mean in real life for patients and others? How tolerable are the side effects? This is a big issue for me. I hate that in clinical trials they will only tell you a grade of a side effect. I want to know how long it lasts. I don't care if you have a grade 4 side effect if they can give you a pill and it goes away within minutes. But if you have a grade 2 side effect that's going to last for 8 months, that's going to have a bigger impact on a patient life, right? That's my own little pet peeve. And what did this clinical trial measure, and does it really matter? So those are things you can look at. And really quickly, patient-reported outcome measures. So what's important to our patients we can address when we're trying to go to regulators. I prefer patient-relevant outcome measures. So not just what they're reporting, but really what is really important to them. Sometimes they report things only because that's what they've been asked to report, where we can go back and capture everything that was really important to a patient. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff really fast. Just one thing with this, what we can do is actually capture as well the carer perspective, which is hugely important to the patient experience. And this, I just want to make sure, when we talk about patient experience, this is Lymphoma Coalition data from the survey that we do every 2 years. The red line is the general CLL patient perspective or on how, what physical conditions really affect them during their patient experience. But you see the blue lines, that's the relapse refractory group. So those are people that have had more than one line of therapy. And you'll see that those issues increase every time in the relapse refractory population. So make sure when you're talking about your patients, you're talking about the group that actually matches what the drug is indicated for. So if it's only indicated in a relapse refractory group, see if you can pull information about those specific patients, because something like this can be really impactful. And so make sure as well, when you're talking to regulators, whoever you're being invited invited to talk to or trying to force your way into talking to. You have to match what you're saying to your audience. If they are scientists, they're going to respond to graphs a whole lot better than they're going to respond to a patient story, right? So always think about who you're talking to so you can help shape your message the best way. And this is just so you are really well prepared when you're brought into those discussions. You get all that information together and create one big full package for yourself so you know this information inside and out. But then you have sound bites, so you have a list of things you know that you want to communicate if you're given the opportunity. And if not, you at least have that concise directive so you can say, I need this from you, right? Because sometimes they'll give you a lot of time, sometimes they'll give you a little bit of time. You have to be ready any way that you can. So that is all I'm going to do for the intro, and we're actually going to let David come up.
Perfect.